You can start.
All right, welcome. Again, apologize for the corporate branding. I didn't have a chance to sterilize these, so you can ignore the redapt part. But do have a day job, and the content doesn't really promote it in any way. Sorry about that. But we'll talk about effective analytics teams and just some philosophical things. We have about an hour, but I'll go into probably more detail than I would typically go into, just because more of a neutral setting. So what I've learned over the years, just observing companies and during different times in my life, and the way that sort of I've done some side work that it's been pretty eccentric, and the ask of me as I evaluate companies over the years. I learned a lot, so I think hopefully you'll find some of this stuff valuable. The analytics world for me is super exciting. I do it because I love it. And I've always asked, why do some organizations do this better than others? Do they pay people more? Do they have better coffee? What is the secret? And, I start to figure this stuff out after observing them. As any good scientist would, we observe things enough times, we start to figure things out. So I kind of want to talk about that, and then some of it will be philosophical. Hopefully we'll get through it all, but I hope I give you some actual framework to operate. But I'll start with the Jimi Hendrix quote, that when the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. And so the heart of what we're talking about is, how do we distribute power in corporate America? We, of course, have nonprofits, we have for-profit organizations, but truly, is the structure that's been in place since the Industrial Revolution, is it ideal? And it's probably timely, just because you've probably seen articles on AWS let a whole bunch of people go, Salesforce lets a whole bunch of people go, and they do it in ways that are a little bit inhuman, in my opinion. So if I look at stats like, one of the stats we look at when we evaluate companies is, what's the income per person? Like every employee FTE, what ultimately are they contributing? And if you look at that and you think, hey, some of these people have been at these companies for decades, and they've probably contributed millions of dollars in profit, and they get an email, doesn't seem right. So part of what I'll talk about is, how do we organize teams in general? This could be specific to analytics, which I'll talk about in that lens, but it would apply to any endeavor to organize humans around a purpose. So keeping that in mind, this is really just critique of, power in corporate America, and how can we organize teams to be more effective. And again, some of this is my observations, and the few examples with them is enough to know that, hey, this does work better if done appropriately. So there's a couple of things. Hopefully it makes sense when I put it all together, but I'll start off with sort of a vague view of the world, and I'll just step back philosophically and say, hey, you guys are probably listening to this because you want to learn some truth, right? So I, as a person, hopefully have, everybody is unique in the fact that their past is unique to them. There's nobody there'll never be another Malta, there'll never be another Lev in this world ever. Of course, there's some weird quantum theories that would say otherwise, but there shouldn't be any more. Your experiences, your genetics, all that stuff would be unique to you, and there'll never be another Lev. And you take that and you say, hey, look, I'm valuable because of that, and I want to learn. And as consultants, one of the things that I will mentor consultants on is, hey, look, we fail. You fail, that's a good thing, because you learn and you move on, but you have to move to the outside to fix it. You have to say, hey, look, I didn't fix this problem because I didn't know enough. Let me go outside of myself to fix it. So the problem is when you turn inside and you think, oh, something's wrong with me. And you don't see it as a problem that can be solved externally to yourself, which is another issue. But how do we find truth? When you're a baby, You don't know that the stove's hot. How do we do it, right? So basic stuff. The truth really comes to us 3 different ways. We have academic logic. I can look at Aristotelian logic and say, hey, rule of non-contradiction. Who learns like that, right? We don't usually, and we do not experience life that way. So very few people will go and take a course in logic and figure stuff out that way. So that's probably the least popular one, and what most people, they do as common sense, but they don't realize it. So you could learn truth that way as an academic pursuit, but very rarely do we see that. Most of the truth will come either prescriptively or experimental through or experience. So the prescriptive part would be your parents saying, hey, look, don't touch the burning pot, it's hot. And then the experiential, our experience. We see stuff, we know that, hey, look, every time I play with that ant, it kind of hurts, right? So we see a pattern. So I'm coming to you how? Well, I could say in a prescriptive way, because I have experienced a lot of these things over the years. So it's weird because I get to a point where in life, I figure, hey, look, I've been doing this 20 plus years. I probably got some of it figured out, sort of. So I feel more confident to talk about it. And in my 20s, I was sort of quiet and just trying to figure it out. But so really that's, philosophically, that's the foundation of what I'm talking about is, hey, look, I've experienced a lot of this stuff. Am I saying that everything I'm about to tell you is absolutely true? No, but I've witnessed these techniques used out in the wild, and I've seen better results from them. So another quote here, research shows that every time the size of a city doubles, innovation and productivity per resident increases by 15%. So what does that mean? Again, I show some of these slides to our new hires where I work during the day as consultants. So some of you may have seen this before, but so let me back up. So research shows that every time the size of a city doubles, innovation or productivity per resident increases 15%. Now you can go Google this, and there's actually a big study, and there's a lot of research that went into this. But ultimately what that means is over time, as cities get bigger, their citizens become more efficient. And there's other things that go with that, like crime and other things become more efficient too. But that's not what we're focusing on. What we're saying is some things, there's truth to that. The counterpoint is that when companies grow, they actually get worse. So their employees become less productive. So as companies grow in size, they go the opposite direction. So there's some truth to that. And why? Why can cities grow? Why do they become more effective or efficient per citizen? And why do companies go the opposite direction? When they grow, they do not have the same effect. So I think there's something interesting there, and that's the fact of how our city, how do cities run? Is there a grand king that sort of watches over a city and mandates control of everything? No, I mean, sure, we have power structures in place, but there's this dynamic of independent things and forces and systems that interplay with one another. But companies don't have that, right? You'll have sort of the supreme position as CEO, and the board structure, and remember that thing that's been in place for quite a long time in corporate America, but ultimately hasn't changed much. And it's fine. Corporations make tons of money. They do grow, but there's probably a slightly better way. So I'm going to focus on the organization that's the analytics team. Most organizations have at least one, or they may have a distributed model, but we'll talk about what I've seen and what works best. I've used this example before, but there's this spaghetti marshmallow challenge. And if you've ever read about this, a behaviorist did a study. He went all over the world and he gave groups of people a challenge. Here's some spaghetti, here's some tape, and here's a marshmallow. Whoever can build the tallest tower with the marshmallow on top wins. So he did this with kindergartners. He did this with lawyers. He did this with MBA students. He did this with CEOs, those groups. And again, the groups were elementary school kids. I think there was some high school kids, college, like MBA students, law school students, and then CEOs, and all over the world. So he did this like in Tokyo, other areas, just to kind of make it a common playing field. Who do you think consistently won? What group would you imagine? And then if you've heard this before, you don't get to comment. Oh, I guess everybody's muted. So I'll tell you. So obviously the kindergartners. Kindergartners would beat everybody every time. And it wasn't that they were smarter. You know, obviously, you know, CEOs and lawyers, you would say, hey, they're probably smarter. But it wasn't the fact that they were smarter. It's just their interactions were smarter. If you looked at the way that the kindergartners would interact, when you gave them this problem, you gave them materials, they immediately moved to just try stuff. They weren't afraid to fail, and they immediately just started grunting, grabbing pieces, pointing, and having some weird sort of kindergarten language that they use that I obviously forgot since I grew up. But they always won. And the adults tended to start to position themselves like, okay, who's the architect or who's the engineer? Do you know more about this? Or they started to immediately figure out their place in the group. So that took time, and they planned and all that stuff. So they wasted a lot of time when they could have just been trying out stuff. So the kindergartners, you know, they weren't, and some of that's rooted in, you know, obviously they had less fear of failure and just trying out things. So their permutations, they had a lot more in a short amount of time. So the intelligence was in the way they worked, not so much that they themselves were individually more intelligent. So again, there's something there, which I'll come back to. So if I look at analytics and performance engineering as a practice, when I say performance engineering, you know, our clients, or if I'm helping a client, you know, usually they don't call me or talk to me unless there's a problem. They want something. So this isn't working right. Help me make a decision. And honestly, if I frame consulting, there's 4 categories of projects. There's help me solve a problem, help me make a decision, help me create a plan, and then help me find an opportunity. So no matter what the project is, any client or anybody that comes to me, I could put what they're asking me in one of those 4 buckets. Is it, you know, help me solve a problem, make a decision, create a plan, or find an opportunity? Anything will fall in those buckets or a mix of those buckets. So when I look at analytics, the ask is, why does the team exist? So if I go to a CEO or I go to an executive and I say, what do you want from an analytics team? I'll get different answers. But you know, they're kind of along the same vein. So I'll abstract it. So I'll try to think about, how do I generalize what they're telling me? And as consultants, we can frame things. We can, as humans, we put things in categories and it makes us feel safe. And as we consult, it's just a skill that we do. And a lot of executives, it's too complicated and there's too much running around. So we as consultants, if we could sort of bucket things and categorize and make and frame problems appropriately, that makes us good at our job. So I think analytics is one of the most important things, data analytics, because it allows us to measure performance. Without that, we can't really do much of anything. So I'll look at 2 things that data and analytics really helps with. So if I ask any analytics manager, chief analytics officer, hey, what is the purpose of analytics? Again, I'll get examples all over the place, but think about it. Like, think about all the different answers and start to group them together. And I promise you, they'll start to fall in, hey, help me make decisions, help me solve problems. Those 2 things are often confused because they're drastically different starting points. So I'll talk about decisions. You know, an executive needs to make a decision. So they will go to a dashboard or a report, or they'll pull the numbers together because they have to make some sort of decision. And they need the data to do it. So they need to make effective decisions, and they need to be able to solve problems. And why I talk about those as separate is because they are completely different from one another. And a lot of times they get confused. People think these are the same things, and they're not. So decisions are, hey, I have a fleet of trucks and I want people to not hit the trucks. So should I paint them blue or red? That's a decision. That's not a problem. So some people will say, hey, I have a problem. Should I go buy this couch or that? No, that's not. That's a decision. Why we separate them? Because they're drastically different starting points. Because if you get those confused, you're a dead duck, and you're going to have problems fixing this, or fixing the problem for clients or anybody or yourself. So these are two important things. So if I go out and I want to fix analytics departments, then I ask them, how well do you support the business and effective decisions? We don't know. It's always the subjective. And if I ask for measures, if I ask for performance measures on how analytics work, data scientists can give me model validation scores. Oh, my root square, error ratings, for forecast, whatever. They can give me any sort of, that's fine. But I'm asking at a higher level. I'm asking, did that data science project even matter? Did it affect the business? Did it help make effective decisions? And those quite often mostly are not there. So I'll have companies tell me, yeah, we measure this, we measure how these models perform. And I ask them, how well the model is impacting the business. What's that data? And they usually don't have it, or it's very scarce. So if you want to look at performance engineering of, hey, how can I perform better as a human or as a group? This is important. You must measure the right things. And to do that, you must have the data. So I'll talk about problems first. So I just want to tell everybody what problems are. Problems, by definition, have three things. They are a deviation from some other known condition. They have an unknown cause, which means you don't know why they happened and that you have to care about them. So those three things, if somebody tells me, if a client says, I have a problem, somebody says, hey, the analytics team, I have a problem with them. Okay, what's the problem? Was there a deviation? No, they've always sucked. Well, that's not a problem. There has to be a deviation. So if they do come to me and say, hey, I have a problem with the analytics team, I'm going to test the fact that that's even a problem. Because if they come to me and say, hey, look, they were performing at this level and here are all their metrics and here's all the models, blah, 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 and now it's changed, then there's a change. Then I will accept the fact that you have a problem. I'll then ask you, do you know what the cause is? If they know what the cause is, then you don't have a problem. So it has to have unknown cause and they must care. So if those three things don't exist, then in my mind, you don't have a problem. And then is it a decision? So why I get really specific with clients is because they need to know the difference. Decisions will be broken down into objectives, alternatives, and risks. So if you're in an argument with your spouse or somebody at work, just think about it objectively. Like if you understand that the objectives are the same, right? And you understand the alternatives, what typically happens is that two people have different risk tolerances. And what you basically have is they're not really arguing about the decision. You just need to accept the fact that somebody's more risk averse than the other. And that's how we can start to really break down disagreements. But analytics should support this. So analytics and data should give you the ability to ascertain the risks and some data around the alternatives and objectives. So decisions and problems, if you know what those are, how I frame them, that's important because that will be the starting point of consulting. So a lot of times executives don't understand the difference between the two, and I have to remind them because these are drastically different starting points. So let's talk about matrix. So performance in general, I will say that the first starting point for performance, if you really want to change performance, is you have to understand what's the performance indicators. Just telling me, hey, this team's not doing very good, So if somebody comes to me and says, hey, this team's just not doing very good, their heart's not in it, I'm like, how do you know that? That's my next question. How do you know that? How do you know that? And a lot of times there's no concrete numbers. So what this comes down to is, look, you got to have actual metrics, because if you don't have them, you cannot have these very vague statements about their heart's not in it or they're just not good at their job. That doesn't work. So we must come up with KPIs, and the first step is getting that process right. Because if you don't do this right, the performance metrics will cause issues. You think you're measuring the right things and you're not, and then that becomes a rougher situation. All right, so how do I go about thinking about, performance engineering? How do I make this simple for people? So if I go back to analytics groups or data science, since we're talking about data science, you think about what is your mission, like what's your overall objective, and make sure it's an achievement, or what's the objective of the entire team. So I go back to problems and decisions quite often, because that's really why analytics teams exist in most companies. They support decisions, and I've even seen departments called decision support, which I actually like. I'm like, well, that's more closely, at least they understand what the job of that department is. So if you're in a department called decision support, great, I like that name. And if you do data science, that's the end, right? They help them make decisions, whether the AI is giving them suggestions or doing it for them, but that's what we're after. So we got to get the metrics right. So how do I go about creating metrics? I'll come back to this achievement metrics in a second. So let me flip over to what I go through when I look at metric creation. So analytics teams should have a mission, right? To create this, it doesn't matter whether it's analytics, you can apply this to anything. So I'm trying to get to simple things that don't require, books of really complicated patterns. And this is probably the most straightforward way to do this. So with metrics creation, super important, what's the accomplishment? So it's ACORN. So if you want to remember it that way, ACORN, A is for accomplishment. This is it truly an accomplishment? So if you're going to come up with metrics because you suspect a performance issue, and analytics teams can do this for themselves, and they can also support other organizations to help them do this. So they should be able to apply their own techniques reflexively onto themselves. So the accomplishment, what is it? Now, don't get confused with behavior. So I'll go back to one of my heroes, which is Thomas Gilbert. Thomas Gilbert was a colleague of B.F. Skinner, who was the rat scientist, did a lot of behavioral. He went out to the real world and has a lot of nice work that I sort of adopt and put together. But some of this comes from his work. But, Six Sigma and all these other processes, I mean, you can go to school and get certified for all these ridiculous problem solving and optimization techniques, but it's too much. Like, you don't need something that complicated. And Motorola invented Six Sigma anyway, and they almost went out of business. I don't know how many times. So, what did it get them, right? So there's a lot of techniques out there. I tend to prefer the more simpler ones that are just straightforward, get me to the answer. And that's what I'm trying to give you guys. So the accomplishment is, what's the performance aid? How do you know it's an accomplishment? It's because does it persist when somebody leaves the building? So when I say performance aid, this is helping you understand how to apply it. So don't get confused with behavior. Now, it's not like behavior doesn't matter. It's just I don't care about behavior until I can measure accomplishment. And if I need to modify behavior, which is not easy to do, I need to be ridiculously sure that I'm after the right metrics and I need to modify behavior to do it. So before I even look at behavior of teams and how culture and things operate, I need to know, make sure that the right measures are in place. Because the worst thing you can do is have the absolute wrong measures. It'll take you down a road that's going to be a complete waste of time. So accomplishment is just to move the behavior away and ask, does it persist when they leave the building? A person or an organization? So if you're looking at, if I'm focusing on an analytics team, what's the accomplishment? What I'm trying to do is say, Lev's on his computer, he's super like focused. If I try to say, hey, he's engaged 90% of the time, somebody tells me, hey, I have, work tracking software and Lev is engaged 90% of the time, he's active. That's a behavioral measure and I don't want to hear it. I do not care about it. All I want to know is, hey, whatever that accomplishment is, that doesn't have behavior mixed in yet. So if the organization leaves the building or the person leaves the building, does it persist? Then it's probably a good accomplishment. The next thing you test for is control. Do they have complete control of it? So it's not fair if I give a personal metric or an organizational metric and they don't have complete control over it. That's a problem. The next thing is only the objective. So what you really want to focus on first is a lot of managers can say, look, I have 20 things that I expect out of my analytics team. Well, you should really arrive at one beautiful mission or one objective. I challenge anybody to come up with a single objective that is for that entire team or person, depending on what we're looking at. So the performance aid here is ask yourself, whatever that objective is, if perfectly achieved, would performance be perfect? Or would anything more be desired? So an example I use sometimes is years ago when I was at Rackspace, the training department, asked me to really look into helping them increase performance, things like that. And I asked them, I was like, what's the objective of the training department? And I think somebody said it's to have, to train. I forget the way they worded it, but then I said, look, if you had them in the classroom 100% of the time, what does that mean? That means they're never doing their job. So like they had to think about it slightly differently. So ask yourself, if this was perfectly achieved, would performance be perfect? Would anything else be desired? And this will give you a hint that you're on the right track. The next thing is R for reconciliation. This is the goal congruency. This basically means that you don't have a conflict between missions. So what I typically see in organizations is that KPIs are established in isolation and they conflict with one another. So the performance aid here is asked, if the mission is performed or the achievement is performed perfectly, will it be possible for the other ones to be performed perfectly? That basically just means, look, is there any, if this one is done perfectly, is that going to impede the other one? So for instance, a credit department that gives credit, if their goal is to give credit perfectly so that nobody can ever default, and then sales has a sales goal, you can see how there's this sort of there's a tension between those two KPIs. So there's more work to be done. And the number is easy, that just isn't measurable. And honestly, everything's measurable. Everything is measurable. So the end part of it, that's pretty straightforward. So, Make-A-Wish, one of our clients, right? This is public, nobody cares, but it's not that, secret. So what I would do, what I just talked about in Acorn, that's the testing mechanism. That helps me frame the KPIs and run them through tests. How do I come up with the KPIs? Like, how do I actually dig into the material and come up with them? And this is what we use. Over on the right is 9 dimensions. That's it. That really works for anything. Again, I'm trying to make this simple. So we have what's called an achievement matrix. So if I go to, let's say, Make-A-Wish, and I ask them, what is your overall mission? Like, give me one achievement that describes everything. Why does your organization exist? And they will come up with happier child. So their ultimate achievement is happier child. So I will look at that and I will go back and test it against this. And I say, does this persist after they left the building? So if Make-A-Wish went out of business, stopped existing, would that child still be happy? Yes. Control, do they have complete control of it? In this case, no. So could we rephrase that? Because obviously, they could make the child happy. So we may have to rephrase it, but this is something, did I give something that the child could be happier for? So I would, this sometimes causes the mission to be restated. The next one is only objective. If this was perfectly achieved, would anything else be desired? So basically, if I could create a world where every child was happy, would anything else be desired? And if they say nope, we would be exactly what we wanted, that's fine. A reconciliation and number, those are usually, we use those when we break down. So reconciliation is when we get to the subcomponents. So the sub achievements, that's my test. So Acorn is how I test them. How do I create them? The KPIs themselves are on the right. So the achievement matrix starts at the top. So it's better that you start at the top. So if a CEO comes to you and says start at the org level, great. If you're just working at a department, then you'll start at that department level and you'll deal with the mission of that specific department. So once I've arrived at the achievement, I go through the Acorn test, and then I ask myself, how do I measure it? To make sure that you don't forget about anything, there's 3 areas that you test for: quality, quantity, and cost. Almost everything, I mean, really anything that you do can be broken down into these 3 categories and then really 9 subcategories. So 9 is probably more than enough to really help you think about the KPIs and what you really want to measure. So I take happier child as an achievement, and I ask Make-A-Wish, what are the quality stuff that you want to measure? Now, some of this stuff applies and some does not. So I'll go down the list and say, the accuracy. What does that mean? So give me ideas on accuracy, and they'll say, well, the happier child, they wanted a lunch with Brad Pitt and they got lunch with Richard Simmons, right? The accuracy is off. So we would come up, brainstorm KPIs to measure that. So they could literally just look at the initial wish and then the wish that they got. Was it off? Was it dead on or not? The next thing is class and novelty. So class is how good was it? So the achievement has a class rating, and you could think of that like Amish furniture, right? If I go to Rooms to Go, this is a furniture store around where I live, probably not the best furniture, but if I go buy Amish furniture, it's probably way better class. So it's that sort of thing. Some of this applies, some doesn't. And then the novelty is something unique. Like, is there something about this that's different, that's unique, which is not really class? It's a little bit of a, it's like a secret sauce thing. After we go through that, I ask, what's the quantity, like the rate, timeliness, and volume? Like how many wishes, happier child. If I create a happier child for that week or that day or whatever, how many did I do? Did I do 100? Did I do 1,000? So rate, timeliness, rate would be how many per week, per month, per chapter, or whatever. Timeliness, how long did it take? Did they make a wish and then 6 months later they got it, or did it happen 2 days from now? So volume is just a general volume without time. The other part is costing, and I make this simple, but costing is just how much labor, how much material, and how much management did it cost. The way the business wants to break this out is up to them. So these 9 things can be used to create KPIs for really anything. And I use them all the time. I then break down the achievements. So a happier child, what does it take? It takes an artifact. What's the artifact? I don't know, a lunch with Brad, a lunch with a celebrity, or giving a house to somebody else in another country. Like whatever that event, I call it an artifact. And then the event created would be like the actual bringing it together. So was it an actual event, a lunch, or whatever? So this is just me thinking through this. And of course, we break these down into sub achievements. Now, you can start at an organizational level, you can start at your personal level and try to work this stuff out. So if you're like, I don't run an org and I don't run a company, I sort of just run myself, you could apply this stuff. You could say, look, what are my achievements? Whether you go to your boss or it's just something you want to look at yourself, you can say, what do I want to achieve in life, and measure this stuff. I don't know how you want to do it with Post-it notes or whatever, but you can think about it this way. So on the bottom right, I put Amazon in here just because they're probably one of the worst companies for ridiculous KPIs. There was one called the unregretted attrition rate. And this was in the news recently, but that's, first of all, that's a ridiculous name. But if you think about it, unregretted attrition rate. So attrition rate is you left the company. And then unregretted means you didn't regret it. Basically, these are the people they fire. So instead of, so this is, again, this is Amazon for you. So this KPI, I don't know if they still use it, but I know they used it when I was digging around their KPIs years ago. That one caused all kinds of issues. So you probably read, it was in the news, but you can look it up. Basically, managers had part of their scorecard was that they had to fire a certain amount of people every time period. Now, if I, as a manager, had a performance KPI that said, hey, part of your comp and performance evaluation is that, did you let 10% of people go? That was it. There's no context. That's ridiculous. So what they would do is, let's say I'm a manager and I had a great team of 10 people, but my scorecard says I got to let one of them go because it's 10%. What do you think is going to happen? I'm going to open up a fake hire. I'm going to hire somebody just because I need to fire them. And that's what happened. So they literally opened up jobs because the managers needed to hire somebody to fire somebody. You know how expensive that is? How expensive is that to go through this whole hiring process and to do that just because you know you had to fire them? So you didn't have to let anybody else go so you can hit your numbers. Ridiculous. So where did this fail? So it failed all over the place with reconciliation, like failed all day long. So if they would have just used something like this to test that this should even be valid, and then even the achievement, I can even map this to an achievement. I don't even know what achievement this would be mapped to. Like, it doesn't even make sense to me. So how do we get to this state? How do we get to a corporate America that has ridiculous KPIs? I don't know. We've educated ourselves into imbecility. I mean, it's the same thing, right? You have ChatGPT. Oh my God, everybody's talking about ChatGPT. Oh my God, everybody's cheating. Well, you know what? It just exposes the problems. Like in academia, I've taught for 20 years. Maybe you shouldn't train students how to write like algorithms. That's what we did. So now we have a tool that exposes the fact that academia has trained students to write like algorithms. And now, well, the problem isn't ChatGPT, it's academia and the way that we train students. So that's another issue, but come back to that. So this isn't easy to do. I hardly ever see a company do this right. I still need to do this right for my organization. I haven't finished it completely. I get distracted, but you know, this is something to shoot for. So an analytics team, the first thing to really get a high performing team is to get these performance indicators in place, to really understand what are you there for. Because unbounded data science, and I've seen data science teams that have ridiculously smart people, and I just, you know, their models are great, they perform great, they've done great work, and I'm like, what does this matter? Why does this matter? You know, and it's like they're almost like become just playgrounds, and it doesn't impact the business. The executives are like, why are we paying this huge team of data scientists when we don't really see outcomes? We see all these cool models, and you know, I see that quite often. So this really helps bridge the gap so that you know what you're after and you know how to measure it. One day I'll get these slides better. So come up with the achievements. If there's a performance problem, come up with the achievements, come up with them correctly so that you know their achievements. Go through the ACORN test, and then as you come up with the KPIs to measure those. So one of the things I find quite often is on the left, you have your achievements, and they're confused with the KPIs to measure those achievements. Sometimes the KPIs on the right, like for accuracy, novelty, and class, those get confused with the achievements. And that's one of the biggest problems I see. is that people cannot separate the achievements from the metrics that allow us to see how they're performing. How are those achievements performing? And they're a lot of times mixed up. So this separates them. So I'll come back to behavior because we need to talk about it. So if once I get the performance measures in place, I can start to look at behavior. And as we frame behavior, again, I'll go back to Thomas Gilbert because he probably did it in the most effective, simple way that I've ever seen. When I talk about behavior and psychology, obviously it could get ridiculous, but how can I look at behavior in a way that's straightforward, that allows me as a performance engineer to do my job? So this is his model. And it really says, look, anytime you do anything, there's the environmental piece and then the internal piece. So think about, I use the example of FedEx. FedEx comes to the door. I'm going to have a behavior. So if you break it down and you think about what's happening, is you don't have to read all this right now, but there's a piece to that that's the information from the outside. So this first row is all of the stuff on the environment side. So this first three things is the environmental factors. So the first thing is information. The doorbell rings, the FedEx guy, ding, that's external, that's the data. The next thing is instrumentation. For me to get the package, the door needs to work, because if the door doesn't work, the doorknob doesn't work, that's a problem. The next thing is the motivation outside of myself. Why do I want the package? Well, I don't want anybody to steal it. I probably paid money for it, so I kind of need it, and it looks bad on my yard if I just leave it at the front door. So that's the environmental pieces. So there's the information piece, there's the instrumentation piece, and then the motivation. And then at the bottom row, you'll see the individual piece. This is internal to the person, which you cannot ignore. So the first thing is the knowledge. Do I have the repository in my brain to know, what's happening? So if the caveman gets thawed out and the FedEx guy comes to his door, he may be confused. So there needs to be some sort of knowledge in place. The second thing is the capacity. Am I physically and mentally capable of going and getting the package? And then the third one, which is motives, this is internal to myself. Do I even want to get it? Am I so depressed that I don't even feel like it and I give up? That's the internal piece. So if I break down behavior in these sort of 6 areas, again, I look at this later. So I don't even care about this until the performance metrics are in place. And then I could troubleshoot what's the issue. So what you see here is a pristine version of that. So when I talk about work, the workplace, data is so important. So as analytics teams and as data teams, your job is so important because almost always, if there's a performance problem, it is in the top left corner. I will tell you in order, as I've seen them, is that number one, this one is probably the most, 95% of the time, it is the problem with performance. The next one is probably this one. Then it's 3. So if you actually put numbers on these, it would be kind of go this way. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6. Number 6 being the least likely is the person's internal motives. And it's funny because almost always, if I just casually ask a manager, hey, what's the problem with this person's performance? They'll say stuff like, the heart's not in it. They just don't seem like they care about their job. And I promise you that is probably the least likely issue. So data, relevant, frequent feedback. So what does good support look like? On the data side, it's up to analytics and data teams to present this. So a lot of companies, they break them into pieces. So that's another problem, is that data warehousing, analytics, transformation folks just have no idea why they're doing what they do. The data scientists may get it. They have their model. They need to predict this, forecast this, do whatever they're doing. But again, sometimes, a lot of times, they don't know why that's even impacting the business. So you have these silos of isolation where purpose is lost, where they don't understand why they're doing it. And that's a problem. So what does it look like when it works well? So data, relevant and frequent feedback is given on performance. So this could be individual performance or organizational performance, description of what's expected, clear and relevant guides. On the instrumentation side, you have the tools, you have the external tools to do your job and do it well. The motivation side, the incentives, right? Obviously you're paid well, non-monetary incentives, things like that. And then within the individual is usually less likely the problem. Do they even know how to do their job, right? So obviously we have training. Training is expensive. So I always look at the top row first before I settle in on issues with training, knowledge, capacity, and those things. Capacity, obviously that's there in the motives. I won't go over all of these, but I'll send the slides out later. All right, so what does it look like if it's a disaster? So the anti-pattern, so if I looked at the same thing and I said, what does this look like if it's done wrong? Again, I look at it through the behavioral lens. And you ask yourself, have you ever worked anywhere that has this? So let me look at the data one. Don't tell people how well they're doing. Provide misleading info on how they're doing. Hide what's expected and don't guide performance. Most organizations have review processes. They have one-on-one. But it's mostly subjective. The metrics are usually completely wrong. Sales is an exception because sales usually gets it right. It's usually, hey, your job is to sell. Here's the metric. So usually sales is probably the best department that gets this right. But knowledge workers were very bad at doing this. If you're a data scientist and you work for somebody, how are you paid? Bonus? What does your performance reviews look like? Is it, basic stuff like, hey, you seem like you got these certs, or hey, how did your models perform? Some of that's okay, but how did it really affect the business? Did you financially affect the business? And are you bonus based on those things? I promise you, if I restructured a comp plan with a whole bunch of data scientists and said, hey, I want you guys to make a recommender, and I'm going to track how much more revenue we get, and you guys get 10% of that revenue. Guess what? I guarantee you those models will be amazing. But we don't do that, which we should. Instrumentation, incentives, I won't go all these. We only have 9 minutes left, but these are the anti-patterns. And if you looked at this, I promise you probably all worked at a place that either looked exactly like this or had components of this. So I have 9 minutes, sorry, I talked about that, it's probably too much. But how do you structure, performance metrics are one thing, but how do you organize a team? That's fine. We talked about how to create them, which is a little bit of an art and a little bit of a science, but how do you structure teams? Real quick history, years ago, I was at Rackspace. Oh man, one of the big owners, Graham Weston. Graham Weston owns like half of downtown San Antonio. He was one of the initial investors at Rackspace back in the day, a couple of Trinity College students. Anyway, he made acquisitions. We talked, kind of became friends, and he asked me to go and evaluate other companies. So I would go and look at acquisition targets, and I would look at their data and their organization, and I would report back. And eventually he told me he referred me to his friends. And before I knew it, I was doing this for SoftBank and some of the other investment firms. Big Commerce before acquisition. So a side hustle, I guess that you would say I had, was I would go evaluate acquisition targets. And I would specifically look at data, what their assets are, and then the organization. Which actually mattered more to me was how they operated as an organization. And some of the best ones that I saw, one was called Zappos. This is before this acquisition. I was actually working for AWS in this acquisition, but AWS bought Zappos years ago. At the time, Zappos was ridiculously hard to get into. The CEO, Tony Hsieh, who died a few years ago, I had an opportunity to talk to him, and he showed me this model. And this is probably where I saw it, just because I saw an organization with a ridiculously effective analytics team, and overall, the company was very different in how it was operated. So the structure they used, which was called holacracy, but basically it's a distributed model. And I use holacracy just because it's already kind of, the framework is there to do it. So I don't have to kind of create things from scratch. They have kind of software to support it. But basically, you're going to stop this predict and control like hierarchy. So when I talked about power in the very first slide, it's just a reimagining of how can we make organizations more agile. We do this for projects. We do agile projects. We do agile methodologies because they work. But we do it per project, but we don't do it at the organization level. The organization is still, if you look at the org chart, it is still the epitome of waterfall methodology. It is the most, that's why we have mass layoffs. That's why companies restructure, because they reach this huge breaking point and they have to just say enough is enough. And they have these huge reorganizations because they didn't do it in smaller increments when it was appropriate. So what basically this model is, and I don't have time in 5 minutes to describe it in its entirety, is look, how can we run organizations in an agile fashion, not just our projects? And that's the heart of it all. So what really this looks like is, hey, look, it's not, everybody is completely equal. It's not this elegant, sort of system where everybody's treated equal. Everybody, that's not what it is. And a lot of times you'll read stuff about it and you'll say, oh, they basically fired all the managers. There's no managers. Well, that's a little bit of a misconception, but the system basically says, look, we'll give you a framework to operate in an agile manner. It's a meta framework. It just says, look, here's some rules, stay within these rules, operate, everybody mentally, it's a cultural change. You're going to be in roles and you're going to have complete control of your role. You don't have to ask permissions from your manager. You don't have to do any of that stuff. So we have this concept of circles. Everybody's in different roles. So you have this, instead of having this strict org chart, you will have more flexible role structure and what we call circles instead of departments. So I saw this as Zappos. Obviously, I rated them quite high on the analytics side at the time, and ultimately they were bought out by AWS. But we, it's probably one of the better performing companies I've ever seen on the analytics side, and this is how they operated. I don't know if they still operate like that today. It's probably some version of it, but Tony passed several years ago, and he was the CEO who was the big proponent of this. So what you'll typically have in an organization, they may do it, the whole organization, like Zappos would have changed its structure this way. But sometimes you'll have smaller pockets, right? So where I work, my team typically operates this way, but the general company does not. And sometimes it's CEOs have to relinquish control and let this system take place, and a lot of them won't, can't do that, or are a little bit nervous about it, which is fine. So I'll show you what that looks like real quick. So here is, a structure. If you go to your HR systems in most jobs, right, you'll just see, hey, this is my boss, here's this, that sort of thing. But this is this is a site called Glassfrog, and it's just something, I'm not promoting it. There's other sites that do something similar, but it allows team structures to be agile. And if you looked at the whole company, let's say holacracy, you'll see there's the board structure. So the board is in the most highest circle, and then you have the subcircles. So you have the board circles at the top, and then you have the general company circle, which you can dig into, and then you have other parts of this. So you have consulting services and marketing. So if I were to dig into marketing, right, I'd zoom in and you have these roles. So anybody can be assigned a role. So if I picked any one of these, like a graphic designer, I click on that role, and then you'll have a person assigned. And currently it's filled by this person. So every role in holacracy has a purpose, a domain, and accountability. Now, you don't really have titles, so you'll fill roles, and there's a process to process tension. So what I will tell you is that if I had to describe it, it's the fact that they embrace tensions. They say, look, if people have problems, with this person or they have an issue, bring it up because it's the fire that fuels the change. So I will tell you, if I had to summarize it, it's agile organization management, and it treats tensions as the fuel for change. And it treats them as they should. It is something valuable, not something to be suppressed, and it's important. So what you'll find here is that it's very much up to date. So most HR systems are very out of date, and everybody's title is not the way it was when they got hired, and nobody updates it. That's right. This is the complete opposite. This is a constant, obsessive updating of roles, titles, responsibilities, movement of people, because you can be part of more than one role. And it's a constant change. Every time you have what's called a governance meeting, you can change the structure of the organization. I kid you not, I've seen organizations where people will get together and the whole thing gets redone 2 weeks and then redone again 2 weeks later, like a drastic change. That would never happen in typical parent-child relationships in most companies. So I didn't have much time to go into more detail. Maybe we'll do a part 2 of this. We'll see what Liv says. But we have, I'll just talk about holacracy in general. So holacracy is the name of the meta framework. Now, is there other systems in place? Yes. This is not telling people how to run a company. This is giving them a framework to come up with what works best for them. And it lets the employees control their roles, make decisions without having to go up and deal with all this politics and crap that we got to deal with to get things done. It just empowers employees more, and it's more effective in the analytics space. Why? Because it lets the analytics and knowledge workers do their job and do it effectively. So anyway, that's it. I'm at time. Thanks for listening, but hopefully this is valuable. Definitely check out Holacracy if something that interests you. If you want to talk more about metrics or how I think about performance engineering, that's another piece. So really there's 2 parts of this: the Holacracy, which is the org structure, and how do you go about creating metrics that actually help improve performance. So thanks. Take care, guys.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting. You started saying that big cities become more effective and organizations not.
Yeah.
But maybe big cities become more effective because they actually have a lot of business. So organization bureaucracy doesn't control everything. Whereas in companies, probably they're more structured and more organized than cities, and bureaucracies kill innovation.
Yeah, and I think some of that is, companies have this parent-child power structure, and it goes back to, typically a CEO or a board. And there's just so many layers between the person sensing the tension that may be 4 or 5 levels deep, that there's just too much bureaucracy in getting change done, right? Hey, we need a new role. Oh God, let me go convince my manager to open up the rec and this, it's just all of this, everything that should not take that much effort is taking too much effort. So the folks that should be empowered to make decisions quickly cannot. Now, some companies sort of do this, they try to get there. I'm not saying this is the answer to everything, but it is probably the most thought out framework that I've seen, and I've seen companies use it well.
What companies today are using holacracy?
I think Zappos is still using it. But what's different, they modify it to suit their needs, right? So it's a framework. This isn't telling people how to run, like how to fire, how to hire. This doesn't tell people how to do that. It allows them to come up with their own framework. So what you see in Zappos today is ultimately different than what I saw years ago. There's other smaller firms that use it. A lot of nonprofits like it. I could get a full list, but
But you mentioned that in order to motivate people, right, you have to have some leverage, like give them money or whatever. And the holacracy, like if you run it in the whole organization so that the system has this power to redistribute promotions and money, then probably it will work, right? Did it do
yeah.
it at
So
Zappos or?
Yeah, so they didn't tell you, it doesn't tell you how to pay people. So what some companies will do, what I've seen, is they'll do like a badge system where, so one of the drawbacks, and I'll just be honest, like, you get promoted, you get director, you get VP, you get more money. Now, the amount of money you get doesn't necessarily equate to how valuable you are. It's just obvious. That's just part of corporate America. So what this is attempting to do is saying, look, hey, let's figure out a way to pay people, and it's up to the company. So I've seen some companies do a badge system. So if you're like a tech person and you have 25 certifications and you do XYZ, your pay would be based on it. So I've seen sort of a badge system implemented, but it's really up to the company how they want to do it. Nothing prevents them in holacracy to just kind of keeping the old style. Um, but
Well, if you look at organizations, whether it's governments or bureaucracies, like in companies, the driving force, the people want to get more money, people want to get to the top. They're fighting for this. They're really to the death. And this is one thing. On the other side, let's say you created holocracy, it tries to compete with this old and primitive, but actually very powerful mechanism. Do you think holocracy has a chance to actually win?
um, look, in America, there's an ego problem, and this actually works better in Europe. So in Europe, Sweden, Finland, these type of countries actually have a lot more businesses that operate like this because their culture is completely different. But in America, it's harder, and it's just part of the culture of business here. Um, that's why nonprofits tend to use this more because they're really focused on the mission, not so much, being kind of climbing the corporate ladder. Um, but you'll get CEOs like Tony, which, he just thinks really differently. He was a cool dude and he had some personal issues, but, um, it's just rough. I get it. It's hard, right? I know when Zappos sent out the email that they were doing this, they basically told all the managers to find a role or bye-bye. So so there's a big market like McKinsey, Bain, these executive consulting firms live on like leadership, and they use the term thought leadership, which is insulting to me because your thoughts are somehow more impressive or more important than mine, which is stupid. I don't like that term, and anytime somebody uses it, I want to just lose it. Um, it's not fair. And there's so much money in leadership consulting and impressing this fact that you have to be a leader that obviously McKinsey, Bain, all these consulting companies hate it. They hate the concept of it. So anytime you see an article written on like Zappos and Holacracy, I think it's hilarious. They'll put like, after Holacracy, 20%, half of the managers left the company. And I'm like, well, we'll frame some context. The context was, there's a new structure. If you're a manager that actually provides no value whatsoever, please find a role. And if you actually don't have a role, I guess you don't have any value, have a nice day. So that's why half the managers left. It wasn't that they were like, thought it was a disgusting, it's just a purge. And that's why it's just companies can't operate. Obviously, Amazon makes tons of money, but I've seen it done better. And what I've sometimes seen is that workers are so trained to work this way that it's very hard to get them not to work that way. So I've seen companies implement this, and it's hard for the workers to stop trying to ask for permission from their bosses to do stuff. That's another challenge.
Kyle, what about open source software development, right? Because it doesn't have strict bureaucratic structure. It may be closer to holacracy, right? People do like what they can. They make proposals. These proposals being discussed. So it's similar in spirit, at least, to holacracy, right?
Yeah. I mean, the open source committees can, they want to operate that way, they can. Again, it's kind of that city model, right? My neighbor, I don't really control him, but we get along, we operate, we get stuff done. But that's that city example. Is yes, there are pockets of sort of different types of power structures, but somehow it all meshes together and you get effective, efficient citizens out of it. So I would caution anybody that reads about holacracy, 95% of the articles are about people that have never worked under it. They don't understand it. And they're usually consultants that find it threatening.
But what about leaders? What about visionaries? People like Steve Jobs. Could Steve Jobs operate his company using holacracy, you think?
Sure. I mean, again, it's not like it's a meta framework for operating the company the way you want. Like, would Steve Jobs, would he be less stressed? Probably, because by theory, a lot of his power would have been relinquished to within the organization. The organization will merge and adapt without your explicit approval, which is sometimes scary for CEOs. But yeah, I mean, it could work. Obviously Apple would be a totally different company than it is today.
Right. Thank you. Well, more than an hour, but it was very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. All right, have a great weekend. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyle. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, everyone.
Wow.